A cold wind sweeps across a shattered battlefield somewhere in the Ardennes, December 1944. Snow blankets the frozen earth stained with oil and blood. A column of German Panther tanks grinds forward through the mist, their crews confident behind inches of hardened steel. These men have survived Kursk, survived the retreat from France, survived everything the Allies have thrown at them. Their armor is legendary. Their tanks are feared. And then, without warning, a single shell screams across the tree line. It strikes the lead Panther dead center, right on the glacis plate. For a heartbeat, nothing happens. The crew might have even laughed, thinking the Americans had wasted a shot on their strongest point. Then something impossible happens. The armor does not shatter. It does not crack. It sags. It warps and slumps inward like soft butter under a red-hot knife. The turret hatches blow open. Black smoke erupts. Flames follow. Inside, the air has turned to fire. Metal glows orange, then white. The loader's hand is still on the breech when the wave of superheated gas hits. 3 seconds. That is all it takes. The other Panther crews watch in horror as their lead tank dies in a way they have never seen before. This is not battle damage. This is something else entirely. This is witchcraft. If you are fascinated by the untold stories of World War II, the weapons that changed history, and the soldiers who wielded them, make sure to subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. I read every single one. Now let us dive deep into one of the most terrifying weapons ever deployed on the European battlefield. To understand why this shell seemed like sorcery, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment when Allied commanders realized they had a serious problem. By 1943, the war in Europe had reached a critical juncture. The Allies were preparing for the eventual invasion of France, but intelligence reports painted a grim picture. German armor was evolving faster than anyone had anticipated. The Panzer IV, once the backbone of the Wehrmacht's armored forces, was being replaced by something far more dangerous. The Panther tank, with its sloped 80mm frontal armor, could shrug off nearly every anti-tank round in the Allied arsenal. And lurking behind the Panthers were the Tigers, monsters with frontal armor exceeding 100mm, sometimes approaching 180 on the Tiger II. American tankers in North Africa and Italy had already learned to fear German armor. The M4 Sherman, the workhorse of the United States Army, was fast, reliable, and produced in enormous numbers. But it was never designed to fight Panthers and Tigers. Its 75mm gun could barely scratch the paint on a Panther's frontal plate. Crews learned to aim for the sides, the rear, the tracks, anywhere but the front. They learned to use terrain, to ambush, to swarm. They learned to accept casualties that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. Commanders estimated that it took 5 Shermans to kill 1 Panther, not because the Sherman was a bad tank, but because the mathematics of armor penetration simply did not favor them. The standard armor-piercing rounds of the era relied on mass and hardness. A solid steel projectile would strike the enemy armor, and if it had enough kinetic energy, it would punch through. The problem was that German metallurgy had advanced to the point where their armor plates could absorb tremendous punishment. Even when American shells penetrated, they often shattered on impact, reducing their effectiveness inside the crew compartment. Something had to change. The solution came from an unlikely source, a material that most soldiers had never heard of: tungsten. In its pure form, tungsten is one of the densest metals on Earth, nearly twice as dense as lead. It has the highest melting point of any element, over 3,400 degrees Celsius. It is incredibly hard, incredibly strong, and incredibly expensive. Before the war, tungsten was used primarily in industrial applications, in light bulb filaments, in high-speed cutting tools. No one had seriously considered using it as a weapon, but desperate times called for desperate measures. American engineers began experimenting with tungsten carbide cores, Wrapped in lightweight aluminum or steel sabots, the concept was elegant in its simplicity. By concentrating the mass of the projectile into a small, ultra-dense core, they could dramatically increase the impact pressure at the point of contact. Instead of spreading the kinetic energy across a large surface area, the tungsten core would focus it into a tiny point, like pressing a needle through fabric instead of trying to push the entire finger through. The result was the HVIAP round, high-velocity armor-piercing. On paper, the specifications were impressive. The new shell could leave the barrel at velocities approaching 1,200 meters per second, significantly faster than standard ammunition. But what happened at the moment of impact was something no one had quite anticipated. When the tungsten core struck enemy armor at that velocity, the kinetic energy concentrated at the impact point generated temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius. The tungsten itself did not melt. Its melting point was far too high, but the steel armor around it did. The projectile essentially drilled through, creating a jet of molten metal and superheated gas that flooded the interior of the tank. It was not an explosion in the traditional sense. There was no massive fireball, no thunderous detonation. Instead, there was a terrible focused destruction that cooked everything in its path. The first shipments of HVAP rounds arrived in France in October 1944, distributed only to select units facing the heaviest German armor. Secrecy was paramount. Allied commanders did not want the Germans to know what was coming. The rounds were marked differently, stored separately, and issued with strict instructions. Use them only when absolutely necessary. Use them only against the toughest targets. Do not waste them on infantry or soft vehicles. There were never enough tungsten rounds to go around. Global supplies of tungsten were limited, and the manufacturing process was complex and expensive. Each round was precious, treated almost like a talisman by the crews who received them. Tankers would hoard them, mark them, hide them in personal stashes. They saved them for the moment when death was certain without them. The first combat uses of the HVAP round produced results that stunned everyone, including the Americans who fired them. Reports began filtering back from the front lines, accounts so strange that commanders initially dismissed them as exaggeration. Soldiers were known to embellish, after all. In the chaos of combat, perception could be unreliable. But then the photographs arrived, and the photographs did not lie. Tankers described impacts unlike anything they had ever seen. The armor did not shatter or crack in the familiar patterns of conventional anti-tank fire. Instead, it warped, it sagged, it folded inward like warm wax pressed by an invisible finger. One soldier compared the effect to pushing a red-hot poker into wet clay. Another said it looked like a steel candle collapsing under its own weight. The entry holes were almost perfectly circular, their edges fused smooth like polished glass. Inside the destroyed tanks, forensic teams discovered something even more disturbing. Crew members killed not by spalling or explosion, but by the rapid pressure spike and thermal flash that followed penetration. Men found dead at their posts, with no visible external wounds, just burns that seemed to come from inside out. Word spread through the ranks with the speed of wildfire. The Americans have a new shell. It melts tanks. The Germans called it many things. Some reports referred to it as der Hexenschuss, the witch's shot. Others simply called it unnatural. Captured prisoners spoke of it with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Whatever you are firing at us," one German soldier reportedly told his captors, "it is not normal ammunition." Veterans who had survived Stalingrad, men who had seen the worst that modern warfare could offer, broke down in panic when they heard that the Witchcraft shells had been deployed to their sector. Tank commanders began refusing orders to advance against American positions. Morale, already strained by years of retreat and defeat, crumbled further. The psychological impact of the HVAP round was almost as devastating as its physical effects. War is as much about perception as reality. Soldiers fight better when they believe in their equipment, when they trust the armor protecting them. For years, German tank crews had enjoyed a sense of invulnerability. Their Panthers and Tigers were the finest tanks in the world, superior in nearly every measurable way to their Allied counterparts. That confidence had carried them through countless engagements, had made them willing to take risks, to press attacks, to hold positions that should have been untenable. Now that confidence was shattered. The armor that had once seemed impenetrable was suddenly vulnerable. Worse than vulnerable, it was actively dangerous. A tank that could be melted from the outside could become a crematorium for its crew. The psychological contract between man and machine was broken. The Wehrmacht's technical intelligence branch, known as the Waffenamt, scrambled to understand what the Americans had deployed. They collected battlefield reports, examined destroyed vehicles, interviewed survivors. Initial theories ranged from incendiary rounds to some kind of chemical agent that weakened steel. None of them quite captured the truth. The physics of the HVAP round were difficult to explain to men who had spent their careers thinking about armor in terms of thickness and angle. The concept of concentrated kinetic energy, of turning steel into a quasi-liquid state for fractions of a second, was almost too abstract to grasp. And yet the evidence was undeniable. The melted armor, the glassed edges, the terrible surgical precision of the kills. Let us pause for a moment to consider the men on the other side of this equation, the American tankers who fired these rounds. For them, the HVAP shell was more than just a better weapon. It was redemption. For months they had watched their friends die in Shermans that the Germans mockingly called Tommykoschers and Ronsons, tanks that burned so easily that their crews barely had time to escape. They had charged into battle, knowing that their 75mm guns were inadequate, that their armor was too thin, that the only way to win was to accept losses that would break any normal unit. They had developed the dark gallows humor that soldiers use to cope with impossible situations. "Why do the Germans call us Ronsons?" the joke went. "Because we light up the first time, every time." But now they had something that could fight back. Now they had a weapon that could kill Panthers and Tigers with a single shot. The transformation in morale was immediate and profound. Tankers who had been reluctant to engage German armor suddenly sought out the fight. Crews that had been demoralized found new purpose. The HVAP round did not just change the tactical situation. It changed the spirit of the men who used it. The Battle of the Bulge, which erupted in December 1944, provided the ultimate test for the new ammunition. Hitler had gambled everything on a massive offensive through the Ardennes, hoping to split the Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. The German army threw its remaining armored reserves into the attack, including entire battalions of Panthers and Tigers. For the first few days, the offensive succeeded beyond expectations. The Americans were caught off guard, their lines broken, their units scattered. But as the initial shock wore off and reinforcements arrived, the tide began to turn. And the HVAP round played a crucial role in that turning. At crossroads and choke points throughout the Ardennes, American tank destroyers and upgraded Shermans lay in wait for the advancing German armor. The snow and fog that had aided the German surprise attack now worked against them, limiting visibility and channeling their tanks into predictable routes. When the shooting started, the results were devastating. German tank commanders reported strange impacts, unlike any they had encountered. Armor plates seemed to bubble inward. Single hits left tanks unrecognizable. Crews that had survived multiple engagements throughout the war found themselves facing a weapon they could not understand and could not counter. One particular engagement became legendary among both American and German forces. A company of German King Tigers, the fearsome Tiger II, with its massive 185mm turret armor, advanced toward a village held by American infantry and a handful of tank destroyers. The King Tiger was considered virtually invincible. Its frontal armor could withstand anything the Allies possessed, or so the Germans believed. The first American shot struck the lead King Tiger dead center on the turret face. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the turret hatches blew open, smoke poured out, followed by flames. The mighty King Tiger ground to a halt, its engine still running, but its crew already eliminated. The tungsten core had done the impossible. It had punched through 180 millimeters of the finest German steel ever produced. When American soldiers later examined the wreck, they found a nearly perfect circular penetration surrounded by heat-affected zones where the steel had partially liquefied before resolidifying. Inside, the compartment looked like a blast furnace. "It cooked them," one engineer whispered. The destruction of the King Tiger became one of the most commonly cited examples of the HVAP shell's power. The fact that it happened to a Tiger II, a tank many believed was armor-proof, cemented the shell's reputation across the entire front. German morale, already fragile, suffered another blow. If even the King Tiger could not protect its crew, what could? The psychological warfare aspect of the HVAP round was now fully established. It had become more than a weapon. It had become a symbol, a myth, a whispered legend that traveled faster than any official report. The marks of the Witchcraft shells were unmistakable wherever they appeared. Warped armor, folded plates, impacts that defied easy explanation. Engineers collected data from dozens of wrecks, refining their understanding of the shell's performance. Every new battlefield provided more examples of the strange deformation effect that soldiers had come to describe as melting. The term itself was not technically accurate. The armor did not literally melt in the way ice melts in warm water. What happened was more complex. The incredible velocity and energy concentration at the point of impact pushed the armor beyond its elastic limit, making it behave like something between solid and liquid for an instant. But the distinction was academic to the soldiers on both sides. What mattered was the result. German tanks died, American tankers lived, and the war moved inexorably toward its conclusion. Throughout the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945, the HVAP round continued to prove its worth. As American forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into Germany itself, they encountered the last desperate resistance of the Wehrmacht. Scratch units of German armor, a mix of veterans and hastily trained replacements, threw themselves against the advancing Allies. Many of these units had heard the stories about the Witchcraft shells. Some refused to engage. Others fought with the fatalism of men who knew they were doomed. The battles were often brief and brutally one-sided. If you are still watching, take a moment to like this video. It really helps the channel grow and allows me to continue producing these deep dives into military history. Share it with a friend who loves World War II history. Now let us continue with the story. The physics behind the HVAP round deserve a closer examination because understanding the science helps us appreciate just how revolutionary this weapon truly was. Traditional armor-piercing rounds of the era relied on what engineers call the long rod penetrator concept. A dense, elongated projectile would strike the target at high velocity, and its kinetic energy would hopefully punch a hole through the armor. The effectiveness of such rounds depended on several factors: the mass of the projectile, its velocity, the hardness of both the projectile and the target, and the angle of impact. German engineers had spent years optimizing their armor to defeat exactly this type of threat. They developed face-hardened steel, which was incredibly hard on the surface but relatively soft underneath. When a conventional armor-piercing round struck this face-hardened plate, the hard surface would shatter or deform the tip of the projectile, reducing its penetrating power. Sloped armor further complicated matters by increasing the effective thickness that any round had to penetrate and by encouraging ricochets. The tungsten carbide core of the HVAP round changed this equation entirely. Tungsten carbide is one of the hardest materials known to engineering, approaching diamond on the hardness scale. When it struck face-hardened armor, it did not shatter or deform. Instead, it retained its shape, concentrating the impact energy into an incredibly small area. The pressure at this point exceeded anything conventional metallurgy was designed to withstand. Under such extreme conditions, steel begins to behave in strange ways. It does not simply break or crack. It flows. It deforms. It acts almost like a very thick liquid for a fraction of a second before resolidifying. This phenomenon, known as hydrodynamic penetration, was not well understood at the time. Engineers observed the effects but struggled to explain them theoretically. It would take decades of research and the development of modern computational methods to fully model what happened in that fraction of a second when tungsten met steel. The thermal effects were equally impressive. When the tungsten core struck, the kinetic energy was converted almost instantly into heat. Temperatures at the impact point exceeded 1,200 degrees Celsius, well above the melting point of steel. The tungsten itself remained solid because its melting point is so extraordinarily high, but the armor around it did not enjoy this protection. The steel at the impact point liquefied, and as the tungsten core pushed through, it carried a jet of molten metal with it. This jet, combined with superheated gases, flooded the interior of the target vehicle. The effect was devastating. Crew members were exposed not only to the direct impact of the penetrator, but also to a wave of extreme heat and pressure that left almost no chance of survival. Unlike conventional penetrations, where crew members might escape if the round passed through a non-vital area, the HVAP round created lethal conditions throughout the entire crew compartment. The shortage of tungsten meant that HVAP rounds could never completely replace conventional ammunition. The global supply of tungsten was limited, with most deposits located in China, Portugal, and a few other countries. The Allies controlled some of these sources, but not enough to mass-produce tungsten-cored rounds in the quantities that industrial warfare demanded. Each HVAP round used tungsten that could otherwise have been employed in machine tools, aircraft components, and other critical applications. The War Production Board had to carefully balance these competing demands. As a result, HVAP rounds remained scarce throughout the war. Units received them in limited quantities and hoarded them jealously. Some crews developed elaborate systems for tracking their precious tungsten rounds, marking them with personal symbols and storing them in hidden compartments within their tanks. The scarcity only added to the mystique surrounding the weapon. In an army of mass production where Shermans rolled off assembly lines by the thousands and artillery shells were measured in boxcar loads, the HVAP round remained a precious resource, almost a talisman against the feared German armor. The British developed their own version of the tungsten-cored round, which they called APDS, Armor-Piercing Discarding Sabot. The concept was similar, but the execution differed in important details. The British round used a smaller tungsten core wrapped in a larger caliber sabot that fell away after leaving the barrel. This allowed the projectile to achieve even higher velocities while reducing barrel wear. British tank crews appreciated the new ammunition for many of the same reasons their American counterparts valued HVAP. It gave them a fighting chance against German armor that had previously seemed invincible. The psychological impact was the same on both sides of the Atlantic. Men who had feared the panther and tiger now hunted them aggressively. The balance of power on the armored battlefield had shifted. German engineers attempted to respond to the new threat, but they were fighting against the tide of history. By late 1944, Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing and Soviet advances. New tank designs remained on the drawing board for lack of resources. Existing tanks could not be up-armored without sacrificing mobility and reliability. The Germans experimented with Schürzen, additional armor plates hung on the sides of tanks, but these were designed primarily to defeat Soviet anti-tank rifles and shaped charge weapons, not tungsten penetrators. There was simply no practical way to make a tank immune to the HVAP round without building something so heavy it could barely move. The mathematics of armor protection had finally caught up with German engineering prowess. The human stories behind the statistics reveal the true impact of the Witchcraft shells. Consider the experience of a German tank commander named Heinrich, whose account was recorded by American intelligence officers after his capture in early 1945. Heinrich had served in Panthers since their introduction in 1943. He had survived Kursk, the retreat through Ukraine, the desperate battles in Poland. He considered himself a veteran of veterans, a man who had seen everything the war could offer. Nothing had prepared him for what he encountered in the Ardennes. His platoon of 4 Panthers was advancing toward a village when the lead tank simply stopped. There was no explosion, no dramatic fireball, just a sudden halt. Smoke began seeping from the turret hatches. Heinrich ordered his driver to reverse while he tried to raise the lead tank on the radio. No response. The 2nd Panther tried to move forward to provide cover, and it too was hit. This time Heinrich saw the flash from the tree line. A single shot. The armor on the 2nd Panther's turret seemed to ripple inward, as if pressed by a giant invisible thumb. Flames erupted. Heinrich's own tank reversed desperately, throwing up clouds of snow. They made it to cover behind a farmhouse. When Heinrich looked back, 2 of his Panthers were burning. The other 2 crews had abandoned their vehicles and were running through the snow. Later, when Heinrich examined the wrecks, he found the same strange damage pattern. Perfectly circular holes, edges fused smooth. Armor that had flowed like soft metal. He had never seen anything like it. He would never forget it. American tankers had their own stories, stories of redemption and revenge. John, a Sherman commander from Pennsylvania, had lost his entire original crew to a Tiger ambush in Normandy. He alone had survived, badly burned, pulled from his blazing tank by infantry, who happened to be nearby. After weeks in the hospital, he had returned to his unit, taken command of a new Sherman, and trained a new crew. He was one of the first to receive HVAP rounds when they arrived at his unit in October 1944. He treated them almost religiously, storing them in a special ammunition box that he checked every morning. For John, those tungsten rounds represented more than tactical advantage. They represented justice. When his unit encountered a Tiger near a Belgian village in December, John was ready. The Tiger was hull down behind a low ridge, only its turret visible. Conventional wisdom said to flank it, to find a side shot, to avoid that impenetrable frontal armor at all costs. John ignored conventional wisdom. He ordered his gunner to aim for the turret face and load one of the precious HVAP rounds. The shot rang out. It struck the Tiger just below the gun mantlet. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the turret hatches flew open, and smoke poured out. The Tiger did not explode. It simply died. John watched as the crew bailed out, stumbling through the snow in shock. For the first time since Normandy, he felt something like peace. The legacy of the HVAP round extends far beyond the Second World War. The principles it established, the use of dense sub-caliber penetrators to defeat armored targets, became the foundation for modern anti-tank ammunition. Today's tank rounds, like the American M829 series and the British L-27, are direct descendants of those first tungsten-cored shells. They use depleted uranium or tungsten alloy penetrators launched at velocities approaching 1,700 meters per second. The physics are the same, just refined and enhanced by 70 years of engineering progress. Modern tank armor has responded with composite materials, reactive armor, and active protection systems. The race between weapon and armor continues just as it has since the first tank rolled onto a battlefield in 1916. But there was something unique about those first HVAP rounds, something that cannot be replicated by modern technology. For the soldiers who used them and faced them, they represented a moment of transition, a point where the old rules of armored warfare suddenly ceased to apply. German crews who had spent years believing in the invincibility of their tanks discovered that belief was no protection against physics. American crews who had accepted death as the price of their inadequate equipment discovered that technology could tip the scales in their favor. The psychological dimension of the HVAP round, the fear and hope it inspired, made it more than just another weapon. It made it a legend. The Witchcraft nickname stuck because it captured something essential about the experience of facing these rounds. War is chaos. Soldiers cling to what they can understand, to patterns and rules that help them make sense of the madness around them. Armor should stop shells. Thick armor should stop shells better than thin armor. These were rules that men had lived and died by for decades. The HVAP round broke those rules. It made the impossible possible. It turned certainty into doubt. Soldiers on both sides reached for the only explanation that seemed to fit their experience. Witchcraft, sorcery, black magic made manifest in tungsten and steel. As the war in Europe ground toward its conclusion in the spring of 1945, the HVAP round continued to claim victims. German resistance was crumbling, but scattered units still fought with desperate fury. In some ways, the final months of the war were the most dangerous for Allied tankers. The enemy was unpredictable, often fanatical, willing to sacrifice everything for a few more days of resistance. Ambushes were common. Trapped German units would hide among the rubble of destroyed cities and strike without warning. The HVAP round proved invaluable in these close-quarters battles, where the ability to destroy a panther with a single shot could mean the difference between life and death for an entire crew. Concrete fortifications, bunkers, and pillboxes also fell victim to the impressive penetrating power of the tungsten rounds. Though the melting effect was most noticeable on tank armor, some soldiers claimed the rounds left unusual craters in thick concrete as well. The focused energy that could defeat steel also made short work of reinforced positions that had withstood conventional bombardment. Defensive lines that the Germans had expected to hold for weeks fell in days, as American forces punched through with their new ammunition. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. The tanks fell silent. The survivors began the long process of returning to their lives, carrying with them memories that would never fade. The HVAP round took its place in military history, celebrated by some as a war-winning weapon, dismissed by others as merely one technological advancement among many. But for the men who had used it and faced it, there was no ambiguity. They knew what they had witnessed. They had seen the Witchcraft shells at work. The post-war period brought new perspectives on the weapon. Allied technical teams examined captured German documents and interviewed surviving engineers. They learned that German intelligence had been aware of the HVAP round almost from its first deployment, but had been unable to develop effective countermeasures. The tungsten shortage that limited Allied production had also prevented the Germans from developing their own version. They had experimented with tungsten-cored rounds earlier in the war, but had abandoned the program when other priorities consumed their limited resources. In hindsight, this decision may have been one of the many small factors that contributed to Germany's eventual defeat. The margin between victory and defeat in armored warfare was often measured in millimeters of penetration. The HVAP round provided those extra millimeters at exactly the moment the Allies needed them most. Veterans of the armored battles in Europe carried the memory of the Witchcraft shells with them for the rest of their lives. Reunions and memorial services echoed with stories of miraculous kills and narrow escapes. German veterans spoke of the terror those rounds inspired, the way they shattered the confidence that had carried the Wehrmacht through years of conquest. American veterans spoke of redemption, of finally having a weapon that could fight back against the panthers and tigers that had haunted their nightmares. The stories grew and changed with each telling, as stories always do, but the core truth remained. For a brief moment in history, technology had outpaced armor. The impossible had become possible. And men had called it witchcraft because they had no better word for what they had witnessed. The lessons of the HVAP round continue to resonate in modern military thinking. Every advancement in armor technology is eventually matched by an advancement in anti-armor weapons. The race never ends. Today's tanks carry armor packages that would have seemed like science fiction to the crews of 1944, layers of ceramic and steel and reactive elements designed to defeat threats that did not exist when the first tungsten rounds were fired in anger. But the fundamental challenge remains the same. How do you protect men inside metal boxes from other men trying to destroy those boxes? The answer is never permanent. It is only temporarily valid until the next technological leap renders it obsolete. If you have made it this far into this documentary, you are clearly someone who appreciates deep dives into military history. Please take a moment to subscribe if you have not already, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the Witchcraft shell. What other World War II weapons would you like me to cover in future videos? Your feedback helps me create the content you want to see. Thank you for watching, and until next time, remember the men who fought and died in the great battles of history. Their stories deserve to be told. The Witchcraft shells represented more than just a technological breakthrough. They represented a moment of transformation in the way men understood armored warfare. Before the HVAP round, armor thickness was the primary measure of a tank's survivability. After the HVAP round, that certainty was gone forever. Tank designers could no longer simply add more steel and assume their creations would be safe. They had to think in new ways, consider new threats, anticipate advances that had not yet been made. This shift in thinking would shape tank development for decades to come, leading eventually to the composite armors and active protection systems of the modern era. The men who developed the HVAP round rarely received public recognition for their achievement. They were engineers and scientists working in laboratories and factories far from the front lines, unknown to the soldiers who benefited from their work. Their names do not appear in most history books. They did not receive medals or parades, but their contribution to Allied victory was real and measurable. Every panther destroyed by an HVAP round was a panther that could not ambush a column of Shermans. Every tiger eliminated was a tiger that could not anchor a defensive position. The cumulative effect of thousands of such encounters helped tip the balance in the brutal war of attrition that characterized the European theater. The German crews who faced the Witchcraft shells deserve recognition as well, not for their cause, which was evil, but for their courage in continuing to fight against impossible odds. By late 1944, most German tankers knew the war was lost. They continued to fight anyway, out of loyalty to their comrades, out of fear of the consequences of defeat, out of a stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable. Many of them were young, barely out of training, thrown into battle to replace the veterans who had been killed or wounded in earlier campaigns. They faced weapons they did not understand, in tanks that could no longer protect them, and they fought until they could fight no more. Their tragedy was to serve a monstrous regime that had brought destruction upon itself and upon the world. Their courage, misplaced as it was, remains a testament to the capacity of ordinary men to endure extraordinary circumstances. The aftermath of war brought a period of reflection and analysis. Military historians and technical experts pored over the records, trying to extract lessons that might prove useful in future conflicts. The HVAP round figured prominently in these studies. It was examined from every angle, its physics dissected, its tactical employment critiqued. The conclusion was clear. Specialized anti-armor ammunition could change the dynamics of armored warfare. Investment in such weapons was not just worthwhile, but essential. The lesson has been heeded by every major military power in the decades since. Today's arsenal of anti-tank missiles, guided bombs, and kinetic penetrators all trace their lineage back to those first tungsten-cored rounds. The mythology of the Witchcraft shells has proven remarkably durable. More than 80 years after the end of the Second World War, the story continues to fascinate new generations. Perhaps it is the combination of cutting-edge technology and ancient superstition that captures the imagination. Perhaps it is the image of supposedly invincible German tanks reduced to burning hulks by a weapon they could not comprehend. Perhaps it is simply a good story, the kind of tale that soldiers have always told around campfires and in barracks, passed down from generation to generation. Whatever the reason, the legend of the Witchcraft shells shows no sign of fading. It has become part of the permanent mythology of the war, alongside the Ghost Army and the Dam Busters and all the other stories that have transcended history to become something more. For the families of the men who fought in the armored battles of World War II, these stories carry a personal weight that outsiders cannot fully appreciate. Every destroyed tank contained a crew, men with names and faces, and families waiting for them at home. Some of those men survived the war and returned to their families. Others did not. The Witchcraft shells killed some and saved others. Which outcome applied to any particular crew was often a matter of chance, of being in the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the wrong time. The randomness of war is perhaps its cruelest aspect. Bravery and skill matter, but so does luck, and luck cannot be predicted or controlled. The tungsten that made the HVAP rounds so deadly came from mines scattered across the globe. Workers in Portugal and China and Bolivia extracted the ore from the earth, processed it into usable form, and shipped it to factories in America and Britain. These workers were as much a part of the war effort as the soldiers who pulled the triggers. Without their labor, the Witchcraft shells would never have existed. The global supply chain that produced the HVAP round was a marvel of industrial coordination, linking distant continents in a common purpose. It was a reminder that modern war is not just about battles and strategies. It is about factories and mines and shipping lanes and the millions of people who keep the machinery of war running. As the decades passed, the veterans of the armored battles aged and eventually passed away. Their first-hand accounts became increasingly rare and precious. Historians rushed to record their memories before they were lost forever. The stories they told often focused on the mundane realities of combat, the cold and the fear and the endless waiting, punctuated by moments of terror. But interspersed with these common experiences were accounts of the extraordinary moments when something unexpected happened, when the rules seemed to change. The Witchcraft shells figured prominently in many of these accounts. They were remembered as a turning point, a moment when the war shifted in favor of the Allies. Whether this perception was objectively accurate or simply reflected the subjective experience of the soldiers is difficult to say. History is always a mix of fact and interpretation. The scientific legacy of the HVAP round extends beyond military applications. The research into high-velocity impact phenomena that the weapon inspired has found uses in fields as diverse as asteroid impact modeling and industrial cutting. The behavior of materials under extreme conditions, first studied in the context of anti-tank warfare, now informs our understanding of everything from meteor strikes to the performance of armor in spacecraft. The knowledge gained from those first tungsten-cored rounds has been applied in ways that their developers could never have imagined. This is often the case with military technology. The pressure of war drives innovation, and the innovations outlast the conflicts that spawned them. The moral dimensions of the HVAP round were rarely discussed during the war itself. It was simply a better weapon, a tool that helped Allied forces defeat a dangerous enemy. But from a distance of decades, Questions arise. Was it ethical to develop a weapon specifically designed to inflict such terrible injuries on enemy tank crews? The answer depends on one's moral framework. From a utilitarian perspective, the HVAP round likely saved more lives than it took. By shortening the war and hastening the defeat of Nazi Germany, it reduced the total death toll of the conflict. From a deontological perspective, the calculus is more complex. The men inside those German tanks were still human beings, regardless of the regime they served. Their deaths were no less painful for being militarily necessary. There are no easy answers to such questions, only the recognition that war forces impossible choices upon those who wage it. The memory of the Witchcraft shells lives on in the museums and memorials that commemorate the Second World War. Preserved tanks still bear the scars of HVAP impacts, their armor dimpled and deformed by rounds fired more than 8 decades ago. Visitors to these exhibits can see for themselves the damage that gave rise to the legend. The entry holes are exactly as the veterans described them, almost perfectly circular, with edges that look fused rather than torn. The armor around them does indeed appear to have flowed, to have behaved like soft metal under extreme conditions. Seeing this evidence in person makes the stories more real, more immediate. It bridges the gap between past and present, connecting us to the men who fought and died in those long-ago battles. The final chapter of the Witchcraft shell story is still being written. As long as there are tanks, there will be weapons designed to destroy them. The HVAP round was not the end of anti-armor development, but merely a beginning. Each generation of tanks has been met by a new generation of threats, and each generation of threats has been met by new defenses. The cycle shows no sign of ending. Perhaps someday tanks themselves will become obsolete, replaced by drones or robots or weapons yet to be imagined. When that day comes, the Witchcraft shells will take their place alongside the horse cavalry and the stone fortress in the long history of military evolution. But until then, the principles they established will continue to guide the development of anti-armor technology. The tungsten core that melted German tanks like butter was the prototype for everything that followed. And so, the story ends where it began, on a frozen battlefield in the Ardennes, with smoke rising from burning tanks and soldiers whispering about witchcraft. The men who fought there are gone now, their bones returned to the earth, their names carved on monuments in a dozen countries. But their story survives, told and retold by each new generation that seeks to understand what they endured. The Witchcraft shells were just one small part of a vast and terrible war, but they captured something essential about the experience of armored combat in the final months of the European campaign. They represented the triumph of science over superstition, of innovation over tradition. And yet the soldiers who witnessed their effects could find no better word for what they saw than witchcraft. Perhaps that is the final lesson of this story. No matter how advanced our technology becomes, there will always be moments when it seems to exceed our understanding, when the line between science and magic appears to blur. The Witchcraft shells crossed that line. They showed what was possible when human ingenuity was focused on the task of destruction. They changed the course of a war, and they earned their name.